Since the Russia-Ukraine war began in late February, one particular issue that has stood out is the sanctioning of super-rich Russians and the seizure of their assets. Now, this measure was largely driven by public opinion in America and other Western countries that were leading the charge against Russia. There was pressure from the public to be seen as acting against not just Putin, but also his friends and cronies who keep him in power. The Russian super elite are not viewed very favorably, either domestically or around the world. They are not seen as particularly nice people. The average voter is jealous and malevolent. The seizure of yachts and mansions, it was a popular attraction. In fact, some people earned political brownie points because of that, while the majority enjoyed a sense of schadenfreude. On Crux Decode, if you were to look at the seizure of the assets of super-rich Russians from the point of view of weakening Russia's economy, and especially from the point of view of weakening the Vladimir Putin regime, how some of these measures could end up being counterproductive. Now, many Russian oligarchs who had previously seriously considered selling their businesses and emigrating abroad have now had to put those thoughts aside. They have no choice but to continue to use their talents and their money for the benefit of the Russian economy. For them, the collapse of the regime would mean a personal collapse. They have no option but to continue to back Putin because they simply cannot operate in Russia by alienating an all-powerful president. Any hope that the oligarchs who lost their yachts will still be able to influence, much less overthrow Putin, is a complete illusion. Most of them have become even more dependent on Putin because of the sanctions, and therefore they have become more loyal to Putin. There will be lawsuits over individuals who are being put on sanctions. Any attempt to try and sell some of these seized assets or the seized money, that will be challenged in court. Even if the frozen assets can be sold off, that's going to take some time, anywhere between 5 to 7 years at the earliest. In the meantime, governments in the West are now forced to maintain these yachts and these luxury mansions, as well as complex financial assets that can, of course, lose value without proper care. A whole set of businesses related to Russia's super rich, but not solely owned by them, are facing losses and damages. There will also be lawsuits from other investors in other countries. But there are obstacles to establishing this kind of a mechanism. First of all, the sanctions lists have been adopted by different countries in varying degrees. If some of the super rich resolve their problems in some countries, then they could potentially face property seizures in other countries. The second problem is how to determine the scale of compensation, which basically comes down to two issues: the degree of culpability of some of these super rich, and also practical political considerations. Let's start with culpability or guilt. It has the following dimensions. Number one, political background. There are some folks who have held public office, some who have belonged to the United Russia Party, which is Putin's party. They've publicly expressed chauvinistic ideas. Others have tried to distance themselves from politics as much as possible. So you need to make a distinction between the kind of people and the kind of support they extended. Second is economic collaboration with Putin's regime. Some, of course, have received state contracts or non-market competitive advantages. And number three is the origin of their capital. Some of these fortunes have arisen from privatization, some from other practices which are impossible without corrupt interaction from the authorities. All of the above criteria are extremely important, both in terms of fidelity to Western values, as well as to the terms of the signal that the story will send to elites around the world in other countries. But they must be clearly and transparently spelt out, and each case must be proven on an individual basis. The degree of responsibility and the amount of compensation should be determined from case to case. Now, another difficult question is how to calculate the compensation. Now, the super rich who have tried to whitewash their assets by paying off taxes and buying assets in Western countries, they would be the ones who suffer the most. Those who hid their property behind complex schemes of ownership or hid it in countries that have not joined the sanctions, they would be the real winners. The super rich of Russia can broadly be classified into three groups. Number one, the Timchenkos, the Sechyns, the Rotenbergs, and hundreds of other lesser illustrious names. Their main assets and earnings are in Russia. Their future in the event of a collapse of the Putin regime is unclear, and therefore their loyalty to the regime is the greatest. Then number two, there are the super rich who have earned their money in Russia but who have long transferred a bulk of their assets abroad. Putin doesn't really care if this second group suffers greater losses because, of course, their problems would serve as a disincentive for other super rich Russians. And number three, the super rich who have kept part of their business in Russia but have moved a considerable part of their funds to the West. Now, this is the largest group, both in number as well as volume of assets. The most famous names in this group include the Friedmans, Avans, Abramoviches, but there are thousands of other wealthy Russians who find themselves in a similar position. When the war broke out, all of them were faced with this question of what part of their fortune to sell and where to stay. The vast majority of them would prefer a quiet life in the West rather than an authoritarian Russia where there is growing risk of repression and redistribution. If sanctions had not been imposed, these people, through one scheme or another, would have moved hundreds of billions of dollars from Russia. Now they are stuck with the dilemma of whether to move those assets abroad and where they will be seized, confiscated, and they'll have to pay taxes and maybe even face punishment for, or should they stay put in a repressive regime in Russia? That, literally, is the billion-dollar question.